My name is Nicolaas van Wyk. I am the editor for Accounting Weekly. Accounting Weekly is the online publication for CIBA, the Chartered Institute of Business Accountants, and we use Accounting Weekly to do a global overview survey of accounting and tax developments globally, but specifically South Africa and Namibia and Africa. So the website for Accounting Weekly is accountingweekly.com. We want to make those articles that we publish very practical. And there's a lot of trending news. There's so much happening within our space. That's why we created Accounting Weekly. I'm also the Chief Executive Officer for CIBA, the Chartered Institute of Business Accountants. Our website is myciba.org, and we're currently about 7,000 members in all aspects of the profession, starting from bookkeepers right through to CFOs. We have registered designations for each of those levels, and then we also have a large contingent of our members working in accounting and tax, providing accounting and tax services for the public for a fee. And for that reason, it gives me a great pleasure to interview today Nico Theron. I've been wanting to interview Nico now for quite a while. I am a follower of his LinkedIn profile. You can access Nico's posts at Nico Theron. And Nico is a Chartered Tax Advisor, SA, with the South African Institute of Tax Practitioners, a tax specialist, the author of the Practical Guide to Handling Tax Disputes, an expert on tax objections and appeals, a tax strategist, and the founder of Unicus Tax Specialist, SA. So I'm sure Nico directly works with a lot of clients, but I'm also sure that he works with tax practitioners that might have bigger or more complex dealings with SARS that they don't know how to handle as they should. It gives me great pleasure to speak with Nico and make his services available to the readers of Accounting Weekly. So welcome, Nico, to our discussion on Accounting Weekly.
Thanks, Nicholas, and hello to your listeners as well. Thanks for having me.
So you've been in the profession for quite a number of years. I see on your LinkedIn profile, started as a tax consultant in 2008, worked at PKF as an assistant tax manager, a partner at Tax Consulting South Africa, and then you founded Unicus. Tell us a little bit more about your career development up until this point.
Right, sure, Nicholas. So, I realized very soon, at varsity days still that I have a very strong passion for tax. And I decided to of course, specialize and into my studies in the tax field, and soon found myself in a tax consultant position at my first job, where I realized that my passion for tax is quite big, and to really get the opportunity to apply myself and my technical skills, I'd need to move to call it bigger clients, if you will, bigger firms with bigger clients, with more problems, if you will, right? More complex problems, and then eventually work my way up through a couple of firms to find Unicus Tax Specialist SA, where we really get to practice tax at a level that you don't generally see in call it accounting and auditing firms. And I'm including a whole bunch of them in that scope, and also not necessarily at law firms. So Unicus Tax is a fairly unique service firm in the sense that although we have, I've got guys with accounting qualifications, I've got guys with legal qualifications, I've got guys ex-SARS, guys ex-practice, puts us in a unique position where you would typically need both a law firm and an accounting firm to deal with matters. We do it all in one go, but then we only do tax. We don't do accounting work at all. I'm not qualified to do financials or to do accounting work. I do have a working knowledge of accounting as one needs in the tax space. So we don't do any accounting work or financials, auditing or anything of that sort. We hardly even touch on compliance work either. So we don't do tax returns unless it's necessary part of an objection or necessary part of a BDP application of that sort. But my career development has always been towards really practicing tax and tax law on a high level, an intricate level, and that's what I've managed to do so far. But that's me in a nutshell, I guess.
Thank you very much, Nico. Your firm, would you mind sharing with us is it how big is your staff component? Do you work with independent contractors? How have you structured your firm?
So the firm is not big, and I prefer it that way. We prefer to work on quality, if you will, not quantity. And I'm not trying to say that everybody else who does quantity is not quality. But yeah, we're not a big office. I think in total we're about 7 people, and we focus predominantly on kind of case by case, issue by issue. So we don't have any recurring clients. They prefer not to be recurring because either it's a dispute or it's a VDP. And most of our work comes from accountants who identify issues, defaults that needs to be regularized, or a dispute that comes up. So accountants, auditors, lawyers, those are the guys that typically end up referring their clients to us so that we can assist. So I always explain we like the SWAT team, not the squad team. The SWAT team is we kind of come in, solve the problem, whatever the problem is, and off we go. And if there's another problem, we'll come in and fix that, and off we go again. So yeah, that's pretty much our firm.
And then at what point in the process would an accountant usually engage with you? Thinking about taxes and filing the tax return. And then after that, there's a verification query that SARS submits. I don't know, I'm not sure, I don't think that is already the start of the audit, but there is these questions that SARS then asks. The taxpayer responds and submits the proof. And they might then, the dispute, at what point does the dispute start? And then at what point do the accountants then start reaching out to you?
Yeah, thanks, Nico. So, look, we do from time to time get involved as soon as a notification of audit gets issued, and really our role, in that space is to just guide the responses, because unfortunately, in some instances where SARS is asking for information, the request isn't necessarily explicit in the sense of what it is they're trying to check. And that often creates a miscommunication because the accountant sees the request and simply responds or thinks he or she is responding to the request, but that's not actually what the auditor wanted. So we do from time to time get involved in assisting with responding to audit queries, only to try and align the response to what the actual question is and to identify potential issues. But the dispute, I always say the dispute starts slightly sooner than the issue of the additional assessment. So in the case of an audit, as I'm sure you know, before they issue the assessment, they're supposed to give you a letter of audit findings, or it's the section 42.3 or 42.2 document, referred to in practice often as the letter of audit findings. And then you have 21 days to respond to that, and then you respond to that, and then SARS, I should say, listens to what it is you said from time to time, and then they will, if they're not happy with the response, they'll go ahead and issue the additional assessment, and it's that assessment that triggers the ability to object. But I tend to get involved already at the letter of audit findings stage, because often, at audit findings, the audit is done. And SARS is proposing to make assessments. It's also the first chance where you can really actually see in clear terms what it is that they wanted and why they're not happy with what it is you've given, because it's not that clear when they ask for a document, when they send you that list of relevant material that they want. Sometimes it's specific, where they'll say they want this, but they're not telling you why. And the obvious reason for that is they don't want the taxpayer to circumvent the purpose of the audit, right? They don't necessarily tell you why, and so the taxpayers respond. And then when it comes to audit findings, they'll say, okay, look, I've looked at the documents. I don't think that deduction is admissible because of this, that, and the other thing. And I think we should be imposing understatement penalties because this and that reason. Now you've got something concrete where you can see where they're going, you can respond to that. And when those letters are dealt with effectively, which is often where we get involved, is you never get the assessment at all, because you've kind of dealt with this dispute, which is the same you're going to do after the assessment has been raised, but the benefit before the assessment is raised is the debt is not there yet. And if you can squash the proposed assessment already at that stage, that's wonderful. And that is often possible, if not entirely, right? So sometimes you can't entirely deal with the entire proposed assessment, but you can squash a big portion of it by just responding appropriately. And I think the issue often is onus of proof is a very misconstrued, misunderstood concept, I think, in practice. And that's why we see often unnecessary assessments being raised that could have been avoided if the audit findings had been responded to comprehensively. And I think the reason it's not often responded to comprehensively is a bit of a lack of understanding of onus of proof. Um, it's just one of those things. But yeah, Nicholas, that's typically where we get involved. If it's a dispute resolution case, sometimes at the start of the audit, which I always explain to guys, at the start of an audit or during the course of an audit, I'm not strategizing. There's nothing to strategize about because I have orders on avoiding stuff, and that's not the purpose. The purpose of our assistance during the course of an audit, if we're not at audit findings yet, is to try and move the thing along quickly by giving them what they want, because we know what they're asking for. I can read one line, you read one thing, I read a completely different thing because I know what they're looking for. And so it just helps moving the audit along. But then at audit findings, or then after the assessment has been raised as well. I mean, the fact that SARS raises the assessment because you didn't respond to the audit findings, or SARS wasn't happy with what you said in response to the audit findings, doesn't mean you can't deal with it now after the fact that the assessment has been raised. So typically, predominantly at audit findings, and then after the assessment is issued, and that's typically when the guys come to us. And I can tell you this, because I've been doing tax dispute resolution for many years now, and not so long ago, objections and appeals were fairly, call it simple or fairly easy to get through. Whereas nowadays, it seems as if more and more taxpayers are being forced to appeal, and even after appeal into ADR, into litigation. And so it is becoming more difficult to get these assessments overturned. And it's becoming, I've written an article a while ago, I think it was published in the Tax Talk. I can't remember exactly what the Tax Chronicles, but the issue is, it seems to me like SARS has become a little bit more aware of the fact that disputes is about the facts and the law. In the past, you could speak to someone and say, listen, this is the issue, and then it's fine. Whereas now it's purely facts and law, and if you don't discharge your onus of proof and you can't make the legal argument, they'll just disallow it. But yeah, that's typically in the case of a dispute, that's where we get involved. The other arm of what we do, and really we focus on two main things. The one is dispute resolution, and the other one is VDP. So I always explain, on the one hand, we fight to pay less tax, and on the other hand, we give them tax in the VDP. So often with the VDP, when the accountants or the auditors or whoever it is that's helping the taxpayer compile financials and running the tax calculations, and they often come across issues like, oh goodness, the VAT recon wasn't done properly, or whatever it is. There's undisclosed VAT, or maybe this expense shouldn't have been deducted. And then it's a question of, how do I fix this? How do I fix this without this massive risk of USPs and penalties and interest, because SARS is very aggressive? And that's often where we get engaged to assist in regularizing that through the voluntary disclosure program. And again, on VDP, I'm assisting someone at the moment with a VDP because the VDP was a bit of a mess. The application was a bit of a mess. And I think the reason for that is also, when VDP launched back in 2012, the permanent VDP, I should say, when it launched back in 2012, the process was fairly simple, fairly straightforward. You would say, this is the money I owe you, and they'd accept it at face value, and they'll take the money, and off you go, and you sign a contract, you never hear from them again. It was very smooth sailing. Nowadays, it seems to me, in my experience, that the process is a little bit more difficult, in the sense that there seems to be some level of assurance work. In the past, if you said it's that, they'll accept it as that, whereas now there tends to be often, not always, but often, this kind of bit of assurance work being done to check, is what you're saying, is that really true? Also, is this voluntary? Is there a reason we can reject it? The USP behavior classification is a problem. Payment terms is a problem. There are many things to bear in mind in a VDP application. Amongst the most important things, two things. One is payment, making sure the taxpayer is in a position to settle by the time you apply or soon thereafter. And the other thing is the full and complete requirement. Although there's some assurance work being done in a VDP application by SARS, they don't do audits on the work. They accept to a large extent what you've given them, having done one or two assurance checks, but they accept to a large extent what you're doing. And so really, the quantification of this exposure is a self-assessment exercise, where the taxpayer will say, well, okay, this is the money I owe. And depending on the facts of the case, determining that liability is not that straightforward. I recently recall doing a VDP for a controlled foreign company. It was a natural person who had shares, and the calculations and quantifying correctly, especially given often the absence of evidence in support of these things, because it often goes back years, is fairly intricate. And if you get that wrong, your application isn't full and complete in all material respects, so they can reject the application later. So you won't see necessarily in practice that they will reject the application at the time you apply. It'll take 2 years afterwards. They'll go, but hang on, now the auditor is checking this stuff outside of VDP, and they find that what you disclosed wasn't full and complete because there was an error in your calc, so you didn't apply that principle correctly or this one. And then they can then reject the VDP application and withdraw relief, which means they can impose the USP and pursue criminal action. So when you do a VDP, it's very important to look at it not necessarily from now and next month when the VDP is done. It's looking at it holistically. What is the actual exposure here, and making sure that this thing is ironclad, so there's no comebacks in the future. That's the one angle of VDP that's often misunderstood and not looked at. The other thing is, in the same vein, if you overstate the tax liability in a VDP, you can't object to that assessment later. So it's a very final kind of thing. And so making sure that that application is full and complete, correct, not overstated, not understated, is, depending on the facts, very, very difficult. And that's often why guys would come to us and say, listen, can you just check for me here that this assist with this VDP application? So yeah, I can talk about VDPs and disputes for ages, but I'm going to give you a second to ask another question, perhaps.
It's very interesting, the niche area in which you operate. I can clearly see why there's such a need. And why accountants would want to use your services. A few questions came up. So let's just go back to that initial order that you get. You file the tax return, these queries. I see that sometimes SARS ask very open-ended questions. Share with me all your business expenses. Are they allowed to do that, or should they not be specific and say, can you please provide this expense to me? Or can I just say, provide everything with all the invoices and all the bank statements of all the expenses?
Yeah, it is a bit, I see this also, it is a bit up in the air, if you will, because ultimately, the legislation does place the burden of proof on the taxpayer, right? And so if you think about it, if SARS says, I'm auditing your expenses, and you have to prove that those expenses are deductible, which you do have to, they can call on you, I guess, to justify then all of the expenses, right? Having said that, is the Pretoria East Motors case created this principle, because you can't have the situation where taxpayers carry the burden of proof, so SARS can say, give me everything, and if you don't, then I'll just raise the assessment on the basis of burden of proof, and then you can must fight me later on when you get to court or get to objection and so on. And the court said, no, that even though the taxpayers carry the burden of proof, SARS must still have proper grounds for raising their assessment, right? They must have proper grounds for raising the assessment, one, and two, the taxpayer must know what he or she or it is being called upon to prove, right? And so there are circumstances where that happens, and I always look at it and say, I try and always be pragmatic about it. We can get very technical about many things, but let's try and be pragmatic about this. And depending on the circumstances of the case, if the audit was, or SARS engaged the taxpayer, in my view, in a manner that is inconsistent with the principles of the Pretoria East Motors case, or inconsistent with the provisions of the Constitution, etc., we'll raise all those things in the dispute, right, as part of the defense against the assessment, to say, well, hang on, you didn't have proper grounds for this assessment, because, and you'll recall, I don't know, Nicholas, if you recall, there was, when the ITR 14, I know it's been abolished since, and that could be good or bad news. Not the ITR 14, the ITR 14 SD, I should say. You'll recall when those forms were just launched, one of the things that happened, if you didn't fill in the form, SARS will just disallow all the expenses and just tax the revenue. And they still do it from time to time, not on the SDs because they don't exist, in different sets of facts. And one of the things we'd always raise as a defense to those objections is, on what proper grounds do you believe none of my expenses are deductible on the basis that I just didn't fill in a form? Also, if it's that sort of assessment, then you carry the burden of proving that the assessment is reasonable, because it's ultimately an estimate. And that then stopped a little bit that process, at least at the time. But to answer your question in short, yes, they can. The extent, I guess, when it's reasonable and unreasonable will be very much fact dependent. If you've got a list of expenses of 7,000 line items on a Excel sheet, then saying all your expenses might be a little bit unfair and unreasonable. And so in the circumstances, I don't think that's reasonable. But they can ultimately, and it comes down to this issue of onus of proof, is the taxpayer carries the burden of proof. And it is often underestimated, the extent of that burden. And you often see, and I understand the reason, it doesn't feel right. SARS can raise the assessment. If we talk about deposits, for example, in a bank account, they can raise the assessment just being satisfied. They must form an opinion on reasonable grounds that the assessment is wrong for them to raise an additional. For the taxpayer to prove that assessment incorrect, the taxpayer must bring evidence and proof, and on a line-by-line item address it. And it's perceived as unfair, and I guess one can talk about whether it is fair or not. But at the end of the day, that's what the law says. And so going through that exercise is often extremely tedious, and often it feels like it's not necessary, but the reality is it is. And I see more and more that SARS is using that as a means of getting their assessments to stick, right? Because the burden of proof isn't discharged properly. And so it is, they can do it. There are circumstances in which it would be unreasonable and in which they can't, but for the most part, they can.
Now, this issue, it hits back to an operational thing of running your practice. I think what a lot of accountants, tax practitioners underestimate is the real cost of running an accounting tax practice. And it's typically these burden of proof issues, so that you must be so meticulous. If you perform bookkeeping services, or if cyber has a designation, chartered bookkeeper, and what I always perceive is that business don't fully appreciate the valuable work of a bookkeeper, because it's ultimately them that's keeping all these records in order, in place, so that if an audit comes, that it's easily at hand. It seems to me most clients just expect a very quick service, a quick turnaround, and then the proper preparation isn't done. And you see that in the fees that accountants and tax practitioners charge their clients, which is way too low for the risk that they face. In addition, what we've seen is now, and I suspect because of the dire circumstances of our economy, SARS is becoming much more stricter and maybe unreasonably so, and very harshly implementing the tax laws. And we must also remember SARS has a lot of power. They're much more powerful than any taxpayer. With all the people working for them, the millions of people working for them, the millions and billions of revenue that they have in their budget, the systems that they have. So that it is this big machine that you're up against. So doing your proper preparation, charging a proper fee, and then being sensitive to the fact that SARS is looking for more revenue, and whether they're going to get it from penalties or whether they're going to get it from more harsher implementation of tax collections or tax laws, you better have your house in order. Just your views on what we just discussed.
Yeah, I think that SARS, what you're saying is very important. And I always say, dispute resolution is a lot about strategy as much as it is about the actual facts and the law. And I think the reality is, one thing that you must make peace with as someone disputing or going up against SARS is you are going up against a giant who, as you correctly point out, and I think rightly so, has an enormous amount of power. But that shouldn't deter a taxpayer from standing up, because I have seen instances where that power maybe is shall I say, used excessively or incorrectly. Not that often, it's the exception, I should add, to the rule, in my experience at least. But respect the person on the other side, the person on the other side being the organization of SARS. And I know that's easy to say. Oftentimes, auditors are not necessarily as friendly as one would expect. But just be respectful to the job that they're doing. And it's not something that they don't wake up this morning, at least I haven't seen this. The auditor doesn't wake up this morning going to unfairly impose an assessment. They've got jobs, they've got KPIs, they've got stuff they have to do. And one of the starting points in any dispute that we take, and the first thing I do is check, is SARS not perhaps right? Is SARS not perhaps correct in having arrived at this conclusion? Because often people tend to assume, without necessarily checking, that SARS is absolutely wrong because of this, that, and the other thing, or because they just raised an assessment out of nowhere. That is hardly ever the case. Proper investigation will show that there was notices sent out, there was this thing, and yeah, okay, that is the deposit in the bank account. So there is often a reason for it. Sometimes the assessment that they come to, there's always a reason for the assessment, but sometimes the assessment they come to is wrong, and sometimes it's right. But don't assume that it's just there's no basis whatsoever for it. There often is a basis. There are circumstances where there's no basis, I grant you, but that again is the exception. The first starting point is just respect what they've done something, right? And it is often annoying, to say the least, of whatever it is they've done, because it takes up time and we have to deal with it, and honest proof is a difficult thing to do. but just properly look at what it is they've done and make sure that your house is in order before taking them on. Because too often I've seen guys take them on and lose, not because any reason other than there was no merit to start off with in the case. So it is important, but they are aggressive. They are enforcing harsher. It's something that from a dispute resolution space I've seen in the past, where, for example, people would come to me and I'd say, look at the case and I'd go, look, on condemnation especially, right? And say, well, look, there's actually no basis for condemnation here. And I would always say, look, you can try it, but I'm not going to charge you to do that because I'm going to charge you an arm and a leg to do that, and I don't think there's prospects. So it seems unethical for me to do it. And then they go ahead and it succeeds, right? But it shouldn't have succeeded, and which is great for the taxpayer. But that practice or that way of doing things seems to have been something of the past completely. Whereas now we see them being more to the law, to the letter of the law, I should say. And so it is a lot more aggressive, a lot more. I see disputes going to litigation, whereas in the past they would have settled. I see litigation matters not settling and going to court when in the past they would have settled, even in litigation and pleadings or whatever the case might be. So surely a lot more aggressive. That much I can grant you. But it is important. And to touch on your point on the fees and the effort, it is, depending on the fact, it is enormously intensive to, depending on the assessment, to discharge the onus of proof. I've got cases that you work for months on end to try and put together the evidence. Now, having said that, in dispute resolution, I categorize disputes falling into two phases. You've got the pre-litigation phase, which is your objection and ADR, and then you've got litigation phase, which is either tax board or tax court, and that's litigation. And the onus of proof actually across both phases is on a balance of probabilities, right? It's not beyond reasonable doubt. However, when you are dealing with a dispute in the pre-litigation phase, the decision maker is the same place who might raise the assessment in the first place, also the person who's responsible for administering taxes in our country. And so they seem to be taking a little bit more of a prudent approach when it comes to determining whether a taxpayer, for example, has discharged the onus of proof. And so in practice, I always say that in the pre-litigation phase of a dispute, the onus of proof is perhaps a little bit higher than what it actually is because of the conservative nature, I think perhaps, or the aggressive nature, I'm trying to be diplomatic, the pre-litigation. And so the question you have, I always say, you've got a choice, right? To be pragmatic, you can either just deal with this higher onus of proof, or you can say to SARS, well, this is what I have. I think it's sufficient on a balance of probabilities, and I'll go and litigate. Good luck with that, because litigation is going to take forever. So in my mind, it always makes sense to say, okay, I can either make a big scene about the fact that you're holding me to what is arguably a higher standard of proof, or I can just deal with it and squash the assessment now, as opposed to doing it later when we get to litigation, which is going to be more expensive. So yeah, I think in terms of cost, often I see, because I mean, almost I'll say, let's say every third case, it's always the poor accountant. The taxpayer comes storming through the door, cross with his accountant for not having done this, that, and the other thing, and now they're sitting with this trouble with SARS, and more often than not, it's not the accountant, or it's a combination. It's the taxpayer and the accountant, or it's just the taxpayer, or it's SARS, right? That also happens. That cause the problem. But it's always the accountants, and I think you're right. I think you have a point in the sense that the extent of work that actually needs to go into this is not in line with the fees charged for these things. And so I think oftentimes taxpayers, companies and so on, maybe a little bit misguided in what they are expecting of the accountants to do, and what the time actually is. Because and I think perhaps a reason for that, again, Nicholas, goes back to the history of what engaging with SARS was like not so long ago. Not so long ago, it wasn't that difficult to speak to SARS, and one could argue they were a little bit more reasonable. I don't think that's fair to say reasonable, but let's, for the sake of argument, say they were a little bit more reasonable in the past. And so now when the client is dealt with them, that's the way they remember dealing with SARS is, or when they call SARS on the call center, it's a different story to what the accountant tells them. But that has changed, and I don't think companies have necessarily, because they don't see it as often as we do working in the space, they don't necessarily appreciate the extent of SARS's change in stance, or SARS's aggressiveness, if you will. And so I think they struggle to see why it is so difficult, or why it must be so expensive. Maybe that's part of the reason. But that'll also change in due course, I think.
Now, with regard tax disputes and tax audits, I know there's some companies that offer tax risk insurance. Is that
Hmm.
something that you would recommend, like a medical aid that all businesses should have in the event that they do get like a tax audit?
Look, I wouldn't go as far as to recommend it. I've never had a client with that type of insurance. I've had clients, ask me about it, but it seems like it seems to me at least that there's not a lot of appetite for it. The question, I guess, is it worth taking out the insurance? Well, goodness, it's the same question as asking, is it worth taking out short-term insurance or long-term insurance for that matter? I guess short-term, long-term is a bit of a different story. But I think it's the same kind of question that you should ask. But the trouble I have is those types of insurances, of course, if my understanding is correct, is they tend to cover the fees, right? They don't cover the tax. Right, so it's the fees to fight the assessment, it's the fees to engage with SARS and those, which can be quite high, I grant you. But if you ultimately lose, the insurance is not going to pay the tax for you. I don't think you can insure tax. It's not an insurable event. Right? So I don't know if it's recommended. I certainly can't sit here and say, yes, I would recommend it. I think it's something that should be established on a case-by-case basis. But given the call it the level of aggressiveness that I'm seeing, at least what I can say is it seems the chances that you might use that insurance is going up slightly, in my experience.
And speaking about innovation within this area, you recently developed a tax resolution calculator or application. Just tell us a bit more about that and how can accountants and tax practitioners access this application of yours?
Right, so it's called the Unicus Tax Dispute Resolution app. It's I guess it's more a web, but then most apps are. So it is a dispute resolution application that I founded given the need that I saw in practice for something like that. And one of the biggest issues often that I saw is that people, including SARS, will miss a deadline not because they were too busy or whatever the case might be, it's because they don't know how to count the days, or counting the days is a bit complicated, or getting it wrong is complicated, or is a high risk. And so the app was designed to make the counting of days easier and leave less room for a mistake. Because if you get the days wrong by one day, it could mean the difference between having to ask for condemnation and not having to ask for condemnation. It could mean the difference between asking for condemnation and proving reasonable grounds versus proving exceptional circumstances. It could mean holding SARS to default because you know that the days have lapsed and they're in default, and there's things that you can do if SARS is in default of the rules. And so the application does two things. It'll allow you to calculate, for example, when an objection is due or when an appeal is due. So you'll put in the date and you'll say count 30 days because that's the time in which you have to file an appeal. And there's a on the app, there's an overview of the days. So if you don't remember it offhand like me, because I'm a weirdo, there's a whole list of all the days and which applies. You put in the current date of the assessment, for argument's sake. You'll say, I want 30 days from then. It'll give you the date on which your next step will be due, which is a very useful tool, something we use almost every day. And the other functionality on the days, it will calculate the business days, because when we talk about dispute resolution, we talk about business days as defined, which excludes that there's non-period where the courts are closed over December and Jan. So it counts the number of days between two dates. And that's also a very useful tool to quickly check, is SARS late? Are you late? How late are you? Because that's also relevant. Very, very useful. So it does that. There's some flowcharts on there that explains the dispute resolution process, again, and also the days on pre-litigation and ADR. I can't recall if the litigation flowchart is on that, but that's there. There's templates that you can buy for objections and appeals. Not that, look, I have to caveat that. The templates are a good starting point. They are not your actual objection. It's just a way to force you to think in a way that has worked well for us in the past. So it'll say, this is what you must do here, and this is what you must do there. And it helps to just put context and structure to your objection and strategy as well. So that you can do there. I think there's also a USP calculator if you want to double check, but I think for most accountants that's not that difficult thing to do. It's kind of tongue in cheek that the USP calculator is there for the lawyers because they might struggle. I joke, of course. But yeah, that's the app, and it's free to use. It's just something that I found is lacking, and something that we use often. And I thought, well, if I can't be the only person who can use this, so we'll just make it available. So you can access the app on through my website, unixtax.co.za. You'll find the application there, and you can save it to your phone to use it as a normal app on your phone. And that's in fact how I use it most of the time, because I've got a million things open on my screens on my laptop and PC. So if I quickly just want to run the days, I'll quickly run it on the app, and there we go. Off we go. We know what the deadlines are. But that's the app.
No, thank you for making that available to the profession, and I can really recommend if you have clients that's currently under a tax dispute, have a look on Nico's website, unicus.co.za. And Nico, I don't know where you found the time. There's also a book that you drafted, Practical Guide to Handling Tax Dispute 2.0. Tell us a bit more about that book and how it will assist tax practitioners.
Right. So the book, Nicholas. So the book this year, or the second edition now, co-drafted with Advocate Cornels Lowe. The book was founded again on the basis that there wasn't really any commentary and practical guidance on the rules that govern tax dispute resolution. So the tax dispute resolution process is governed by the Tax Administration Act and by a set of rules gazetted in the Government Gazette. It is not something that SARS makes up. It's not something that SARS can decide what to do and when not to do it. There's a bunch of rules that says what must be done, when and how. And before I published this, at the time, the only guidance there was SARS's dispute resolution guide, which is fairly useful, but not comprehensive. In my view, at least, in the sense of commenting on the nuances of the rules. I mean, something like when an objection can be invalidated and what to do if it's invalidated and what to do if it's incorrectly invalidated, it's not explained. So the book kind of came from 2 points. One is there's no commentary on the rules that actually gives, with authority at least, guidance on how to interpret these rules that govern dispute resolution. And so there was this gap in the industry where nobody was commenting on it. And two, there was some guidance, but it wasn't practical. So what the book aims to do is it aims to equip people with an understanding of legally what are all the remedies at the taxpayer's disposal to challenge an assessment or a decision by SARS, because it's not only objection and appeal. There are many other things that you can do as well. And so the book was said to say, okay, fine. If SARS has done something that I'm not happy with by raising an assessment or making a decision, what are my remedies, one, and two, so what are my remedies, when are they available, and how do I actually rely on them? So practically, okay, so I see the section says I can object, but how must I do it? And so the book aims at addressing that practical element as well. So you find, this is what you can object to, this is what you can ask for reduced assessment on, this is when you must ask for reasons, this is what PAJA says and how it interplays, and this is suspensions and those sorts of things. And if SARS, for example, does not allow a suspension of payment application, well, okay, what do you do? Because that's a decision that's not subject to objection and appeal. That doesn't mean that you are without remedy. What is the remedy? Well, it starts off with the Section 11.4 notice, and the book says that's 11.4, and that's where you send it. That's the address to which you send it. So it tries to kind of be a little bit of a hybrid between commentary, which I try to keep in the footnotes. For those of you who are technically inclined, you can go and have a look at the footnotes that explains the reason, and the gist and the nub of it is in the body. And the practical, this is how you do it, is in the body. So yeah, that's what the book is all about. Because I did see also, it seems to me like there was a little bit of a misconception about the rules and what certain rules are used for and why they're there and how you rely on them. And there was no guidance on it. So I said, well, let's write one. Let's write the guidance on it. And so that's the origin, and that's what the book's all about. It's got some, the book itself, by the way, the book itself has got templates in it as well. It's more comprehensive than the templates on the app. The reason for that is simply this book has got copyright on it, and the fact that I'm the author doesn't mean I can give these things away for free. The publisher is ultimately LexisNexis. But the book has got a bunch of templates in them for pretty much most of the things: objections, appeals, reasons, suspension of payment, 11.4 notices, notices of ADR termination, Rule 32 pleadings, pretty much all the procedures that you're going to rely on. There's templates provided for in the book. Again, the template is just a template. It has to be obviously drafted accordingly to the facts, but it's all there to guide. It's there to make it practical. Otherwise, what's the point? I mean, I've seen too many. I'm a pragmatic person. I'm very technical, but also pragmatic. And I've seen too many rehashes of the law. I mean, I can also read Section 104. I don't need to read a book that tells me that's what the section says. And so the idea was that we don't do that I don't just rehash the law and actually give, or try to at least give answers to questions.
Now, I think it's definitely a book that should be on the shelf of any tax practitioner these days, given the current environment that we operate in. And then your client base, are you available for all tax practitioners to contact, or are you more focused on medium and large clients and businesses?
No, open. Anybody can contact me. I'm happy to work with anyone. In fact, I often work with other accountants and tax practitioners, and we figure it out in terms of how we will work together based on the circumstances. For example, I'm working on a dispute now where I said, okay, you need to go back to speak to the accountant. This is what I need you to do because you're close to the numbers. It's going to be much quicker for you to do it. So you please do this for me. We'll check it. But I always, because the way I always look at it is I try and be cost effective. So I'm the first person to say to you, all right, yeah, this is a dispute. This is what it's going to involve, but it's going to cost you more for me to help to do this than doing it yourself. And then I'll just give a couple of pointers to say, this is what I think you should do. We do that then in a single consultation. But if it's a case where we have to work on it, one of the first things I do is look at, does it make economical sense for the client and indeed for the referral professional? Would it make sense to do this for us to get involved? Because if it doesn't make sense, what's the point? I don't want to. I feel it's unethical, to charge, call it 50,000 rand for an objection when the tax and dispute is 10,000 rand. Doesn't make sense. It doesn't. I'd rather go and pay SARS then. It's going to be cheaper, than paying us to fight it. Unless the client feels it's a principal issue, but that's fine. At least then it's explained. So I'm open to anybody. But I will say, look, I don't think this is a case that's going to make economical sense for us to work on it. But yes, I suggest you go ahead and do it. We can consult on it, but I won't necessarily assist and work on the case. It's going to be too expensive.
Okay, then in closing, what do you see the development of the tax profession? My example that's come to mind is when there were 50,000 or more estate agents at one time, and then when they created the new regulation, that number dropped to 20,000. And the same happened with financial planners and brokers. There was 50,000, 60,000, that number drops. Same with auditing. I know the auditing profession wants more auditors to enter the profession, but the more they clamp down and the more stricter they become, the less service providers there are, and the more bigger and larger monopolies are being created. How do you see the tax profession developing with SARS becoming aggressive, much more technology acute, applying AI? Is there still space for the small practitioner, or do you see coming together larger firms being formed?
Yeah, I do suspect that I certainly see, the larger firms being formed, if you will, and becoming more and more niche and more regulated. I certainly see that in the future. I guess the question is by when. One of the points you raised with AI, and one of the examples is the auto assessments that they've introduced fairly recently, which does a lot of the stuff that, or takes care of a lot of the things, not necessarily correctly, but it takes care of many of the things that would otherwise have been, you would have required a tax consultant or someone to help you do that. And I think in time, I think that the completion, at least in the foreseeable future, I think the individual tax compliance space for salaried employees, not necessarily sole traders and independent contractors and those guys, but for salaried employees, I see that space pretty much closing within my lifetime, if you will. But anything other than that, corporate tax compliance, corporate disputes, even on individual levels, but disputes, VDPs, those things are not something that I see as going to be addressed fairly quickly in a manner that would reduce the amount of people that do it. But I do see certain things. For example, individual tax compliance is in my view, a space that's not going to be around for much longer, maybe for the next couple of years or so, but eventually salaried employees, I don't think there's going to be much to do there. But everything else, I think that's going to stay there. But I do suspect that the regulation of the tax profession will just become more and more and more strict. And I think part of the reason for that is not only because SARS is becoming more aggressive and that it requires a certain level of skill to deal with this. I also think that there seems to be a drive to target tax practitioners, and I think that is because there's the perception, I don't have the data, but there seems to be the perception that tax practitioners in general are helping clients dodge tax as opposed to helping clients be compliant. And I think the regulation is going to come down on that. And that might force a lot of people out of the industry and might even force some into the industry, more likely to force some out. But I think in due course, the tax profession, it's not there yet, but the tax profession will soon be very, very regulated in my view, and very niche and very specialized, because the quality of the assessments are getting better and because the regulation is going to get stronger, I suspect.
Yeah, your last point I agree with. There seems to me also that there's a fairly large number of tax practitioners not doing due diligence when it comes to tax returns and just viewing themselves as a post box. They take what the client gives them and submits, and that's the end of the matter. And they don't apply whether it's a real business, is these real expenses, is it part of a scheme or a fraud? And I think that's something lacking in our legislation. There's just this word, due diligence, in our Tax Administration Act, but it's not described in any what it actually means. And I think that is a big gap.
Absolutely. I can just comment on that, and I'm mindful of time, but I have spoken about this publicly before. Is the trouble is in the pricing. If you think about a tax return, let's use an individual tax return as an example. I don't do any compliance, but I used to do it years ago, and I still get involved in it from a dispute resolution perspective. I don't do the return, but I think part of the reason for that is that the fees that's being charged is not nearly close enough to actually do any form of assurance or due diligence work on the information the client gives. And I think it's not necessarily because they don't want to do it, it's because the market doesn't allow for it. Because if you're going to charge 1,500 rand, there's a guy down the street that will act as a post box and just relay the information to SARS. He's going to do it for half the price. And then the trouble is that guy's clients doesn't get picked for verification. So the guy loses money and it looks like he's trying to screw over, if you will, the client, when it's not the case. So I think that the industry, the pricing model is a problem because, I remember at a time when I was doing compliance, I had a compliance department and the office decided to stop it completely because, one, the risk is too high and the fees are too low. But one of the things that we would do is, technically, when you do that return, you should be in possession of all the documents at the time you file the return. So verifications was never an issue for me. Verifications and dispute and audits was never an issue because by the time you click file, you have the documents on file, you have the RB5, you have this, and I'm not filing until I get it. Now, I appreciate that my situation is different in the fact that was kind of a byproduct of a bigger thing that I was doing. Whereas if that's your main source of revenue, you might be inclined to say, well, okay, I'll do the return, but just promise to send me your RB5, for example. I understand that, but that's extremely high risk, and I don't think that people necessarily accept and appreciate the extent of that risk. It is very high, but then it's a difficult thing, I guess, to sell to a client, and I think that's probably where most of the problems come in.
I agree with you. There's lots of education needed on clients. The profession should play a better role in informing business owners what the real cost is of tax compliance. And it might be extreme, but I don't know whether there should be a prescribed fee that SARS legislates in law to address this matter.
Yeah, I guess, something in terms of prescribing fees is something that I've always thought is an interesting space. I won't comment here whether I think it's a good or a bad idea. I think there's merit to it being good and there's merit to it being bad. It's going to be extremely difficult, I think, to do that. And because the tax profession is so diverse, I mean, you've got people in tax who do financial planning, you've got people in tax who do accounting, you've got people in tax who are lawyers, you've got people in tax in business. And so I guess how do you regulate something like that? I guess you could do it with designations and different layers or levels, if you will, but I think that's going to be very difficult to get through. And also, where do you draw the line? I mean, you could prescribe fees like they do for counsel in terms of rates. You could prescribe fees for letters like they do for lawyers. But I think that's going to be, that could be a good or a bad thing. I guess it depends on the amounts that they want to use. But I can see that as something that's through the legislative cycle will have a lot of debate and might end up.
Now it's an interesting space, and there's different perspectives. SARS looks at it in a certain way, and for them, they have a hammer, and now everything looks like a nail. For a tax practitioner, it's totally different. And what we do see in the meetings that we have is there's still no meeting of minds and the full appreciation of each other's perspectives. And then the thing of just tax practitioners not doing the due diligences in ensuring the information is correct. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been all these VAT input fraud and just businesses that doesn't even exist. And somewhere there had to be an accountant doing something, or a tax practitioner.
Yeah.
So we have also a process, but then again, there's a not appreciation of the business sector about the work that we do and why compliance is so necessary. So it's a big education drive, I think, that's necessary.
Absolutely. I think an education drive is a good thing. And the way I look at it, insofar as it's in my control, is one of the things, and you touched on it briefly now, is I don't think there's an appreciation on both sides necessarily it depends on the level that you engage at SARS with, but between what it is taxpayers are doing and then taxpayers what it is SARS is doing. At least the way I look at it is, and that's why I have one of the guys in my office worked at SARS, and one of the reasons I took him is because I want that perspective. I want that perspective because the nature of the work we do is I need to understand SARS's perspective, and I'm not always able to do that on my own. With experience, of course, you get better, but that perspective puts a very different angle to whatever it is you're engaging on. And of course, SARS must do the same, but insofar as it's in my control, at least in my office, we try to think about what is SARS's issue, what is their understanding of the facts, why is it that they're doing this? Those are very important questions to get to their perspective and their understanding. And I've always said, especially, and it's very relevant in the context of dispute resolution spaces, you can't change someone's mind if you don't understand their understanding. You have to understand what their thinking is. Because you can't change someone's mind if you don't understand their understanding. Well, you can, but it's going to be difficult, more difficult than it should be.
I think that is a much wise word. Thank you for sharing that with us. And Nico, just a final thank you for joining me on Accounting Weekly. It's accountingweekly.com. We do these interviews, and it was an amazing interview with Nico. I'm sure the listeners will be much wiser after listening to Nico speak. Thank you very much, Nico.
You. No, thank you. Thank you for having me, and it was a great chat.
What do our defining moments look like? Just like this moment right now. They look like pride after achieving that long sought-after goal. All the small victories along the way that didn't feel momentous until we saw them in the rearview mirror. They look like the courage it takes to take that first big step. All the times we fail and rise again. And without even knowing it, cultivating an inner strength that is contagious along the way. They look like the inspiration that comes from knowing that we are not alone. They look like the human relationships that give us wisdom beyond what data ever could. They look like the curiosity that comes from exploring, that allow us to create and contribute. They look like education that unlocks our full potential, using our knowledge for impact. They look like choosing our own definition of success, over hiding, over hustling, over pretending. They look like others showing up and recognizing our efforts after all the times we already showed up for ourselves. They look like being bold enough to be extraordinary. They look like you. Right right here. First, we help you see your defining moments. Then we help you seize them. We are the accounting body for everyone. We are the accounting body for you.